Two of my controllers were drifting to the left, one stick wasn't moving smoothly, and I was ready to get rid of both controllers. This is what I did that fixed both of my controllers. The drift would cause me to bump into different obstacles in game, and I would have to constantly swerve to the right. My character wouldn't sit still at a stop, and he would just walk to the left, as you can see here. I had two older controllers and two newer controllers, so I figured they're broken anyway, so let me try to fix them. Here, what I did is there are 4 screws in the back of the controller, as you can see. These 4 screws are fairly easy to remove with a fine Phillips screwdriver. To my surprise, these are the only 4 screws needed to actually open the case of the controller. The first controller served as a test since I really didn't know what I was doing, and I learned 2 very important things that I will share with you in this video. Now, both of these things helped me with both of my controllers to fix them, but it took some tinkering, which I wouldn't have done if they were under warranty, and I wasn't going to trash them anyways. So figuring I had nothing to lose, I figured I'd try to fix at least one of the controllers. After removing the 4 screws in the back of the controller, the next thing I did was to very gently pry the controller open. I had to do this very carefully. I didn't want to break anything. There is a dividing line in the grips of the controller. There's a slight difference in color between the top and the bottom. Once the screw was out, I was able to pull them apart. For one of my controllers, it was very, very easy. For the other controller, it was a little bit more difficult. It kind of like stuck together a little stronger, but I was able to pry it open with just my fingers. After that, I had to kind of align the back with the 2 trigger controllers by pushing them in a little bit. Actually, the middle part between the 2 triggers, the L1 and L2 or R1 and R2, there's a line from one of the case covers that I was able to push a little bit into the controller in order to remove that section. Once the upper and lower covers were apart, I had to be careful because there is a cable that runs from one to the other. Here I had to pull the wire from the circuit board socket. With the little plastic that inserts into the main circuit board, I used a plier there to pull out. See, it's a blue little plastic tab right next to and stuck to the actual wires. Next, I removed the battery, and the battery basically has a white little connector that can be pulled off. Now, under the battery, there's another screw that's on the circuit board, and there's a hole in the plastic that the battery was sitting in, and you can see there where I'm pointing Phillips, similar to the ones I removed when I opened the controller cover. So this would be the 5th one of these types of screws, and this one holds the board to the actual case. So once I removed that one, I had to be careful because things would come apart. This board has the switch sensors on the other side. Before pulling it off, there was one more cable to remove. It similarly has a plastic tab that can be pulled, but it has to be threaded through a slot inside the actual circuit board so that you could remove it slowly without pulling it hard. That flap that you see there that I'm pointing at has to be positioned so that it's flush with the cable, so that when you remove the cable, it goes through the slot. It was quite tricky. What I didn't want to do is pull them apart before I had the cable threaded through the slot. So as you can see here, it took me several attempts before I actually got it through. Once I threaded that cable through to the other side, I was able to remove the circuit board that contains the 2 joystick sensors. As you can see, I set aside the cover and I actually looked at the top of the controller where the pad is at, because I wanted to make sure that I understood how the cable was threaded through. The next thing I did was remove the caps. These come right off by pulling up a little bit. They might be a little harder on one of the controllers they were, but they just pull up. There's nothing to do. The actual cover holds them in place when they're in the controller. Next, I looked at how the sticks are on two axes, and you can see two white little knobs that stick out on either side. So I was able to pry with a fine screwdriver the top of the little box such that it revealed where the actual sensor was inside. That sensor is a round little plastic piece with a hole in the middle, like a notch, and on the other side, it contains little metal contacts that go kind of semicircular around the plastic. Now, one of the things that I learned is that I had to be very careful when I handled this plastic because those little metal contacts will bend very easily. But before I learned that, I continued to clean the metal contacts of the little sensor with rubbing alcohol. I used a Q-tip, dipped it in the alcohol, and then rubbed it on the surfaces of the metal, both inside the little box and on the actual metal of the little plastic that I had removed. I did all of this very gently, and I discovered that some little dirt came out with the Q-tip. This is cleaning inside the square box. I had to keep in mind not to press too hard because the box is actually soldered to the main circuit board below. I didn't want to break it off or damage the insides. Next, I did the same with the actual metal contacts of the plastic piece, the round plastic piece of the sensor. This is the one that turns one direction or the other when you pull the stick one direction or the other. The pieces are small, so it took me a while to actually do the cleaning and use a magnifying glass to actually see what I was looking at a little better. I even used a screwdriver to like scrape the surface of the metal. Once those were clean and dry, it was time to put in the sensor back into the box in the same orientation that I found it. The plastic towards the stick and the metal contacts towards the inside of the box. At this point, using a screwdriver, I had to play around and fiddle with it to try to get it into the box correctly. The hole in the plastic section of the sensor had to be positioned vertical because the shaft coming from the stick is actually positioned vertical. Once the sensor box snapped back into place, I checked the stick to see if it moved around smoothly. And at this point, it was time to reverse the process and close up the controller. I began by placing the thumbstick on the control stick. Step 2 was to place the thumbstick facing cover back on. To do this, I placed the cover below and flipped the circuit board so that both thumbsticks would go through the holes of the cover. While doing this, step 3 was to make sure that the wire from the pad was threaded back through the plastic of the circuit board. Step 4 was then to take that same cable that we just threaded through and place it back into its slot. I used a pair of needle nose pliers to grab the plastic section of the guide of the cable to stick it back into its connecting slot. Again, I did this very carefully, taking my time to make sure it went into the slot correctly. Once the cable was securely in place, the next step 5 was to go ahead and screw in the board back into the forward-facing cover of the controller. This was the screw that was revealed when we first removed the battery. In step 6, I reconnected the battery and placed it in the plastic holder that's on top of the circuit board. In step 7, I aligned both controller covers and reconnected the white cable from one controller cover to the other. Once the white cable was secure, I aligned both case covers so that the two grips were partially in, while at the same time the holes for the triggers were aligned such that the bar between them was able to go in between the L1, R1, L2, R2. I pressed down on the lower trigger buttons, L2, R2. This helped the bar between the two buttons to slip into place. At that point, the entire controller just snapped into place. I then finished closing the controller with the 4 screws at the bottom of the case. On my first try, controller number 1 ended up with 2 different problems. The first was, even though the drift, the strong drift it had subsided, it still had slight drift to the left, which I couldn't figure out what was going on. The second problem was that one of the sticks developed a problem where it wouldn't move around smoothly, which I didn't detect the first time. These are the 2 things I found out that cured those. First, I discovered that I inadvertently had squeezed on the 2 sides of the sensor while I was removing it or trying to put it back in. Using a flat screwdriver, I bent the contacts so that they better matched the diagram here. This completely cured the drift. For the stick that wasn't moving smoothly, I found that something must have come loose inside the stick right where the arrowhead is in this diagram, because pushing gently with the screwdriver towards the green box ended up clicking, and once I heard that click, I stopped and the stick moved smoothly again. Using the lessons I learned with the first controller, I was able to fix the second controller without any incident. Now both controllers work great. As you can see here, there is no drift. I can do high-speed maneuvers, very detailed, fine movements, and there is no problem. In fact, I was so happy with the outcome that I decided that instead of using my newer controllers, from now on I would use these older controllers since they're working just as well. That way, if these fail beyond repair, I could always use the new ones. It's really, really hard for me to believe that I once thought that both of these controllers were trash. While I don't recommend anyone do this themselves, if someone already independently decided to open up their controller to try to fix it, I hope this proves useful.